The book kind of invites the confusion between my life and the narrator's. Um, and that's in part because the book is about the kind of blurry line between fact and fiction and lived experience, like the fiction of identity that you project, the way you see yourself or the way you see others seeing your, perceiving you, and the way you actually are, whatever that means. So for me, I think the conflation of me as a historical person and the narrator as a fictitious character was an important way that the kind of questions of authenticity and fraudulence got kind of incorporated into the structure of the book. So that, I mean, I think of him in a certain way as a kind of exaggerated version of one of my own neurotic tendencies. So I often, I mean, like a lot of the things he believes are kind of extremely stated versions of anxieties I've had about the arts or about the possibility of the genuine. So I definitely relate to him, but there is a fictional space, right? There is that kind of generative distance between who I am and that version of the self that I imagined. Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the ways that the book is ironic is precisely in that sense that he claims he's never going to write a novel. I mean, if you believe Adam Gordon when he says that he doesn't have any real literary ability or any real literary interest, the question is kind of like if you think the novel itself is evidence of literary ability and literary interest, because if you do, then it ironizes his claims not to be a serious writer, right? It kind of betrays his claim to be fraudulent. So, like, he's committed to producing an image of himself as inauthentic as an artist, but actually he's quite ambitious. But he wants to kind of protect himself from being responsible for the work that he produces. Yeah, yeah, the poems in the book are really strange because the first poem that he reads at the poetry reading is made out of language from the novel, right? Um, which wouldn't really be a poem he could have written, right? Because the novel comes after that event. So it's a way of it's another order of unreliability for the narrator that calls into question the accuracy of his reporting. But then the second poem is a poem of mine from my first book of poetry. But the poem really kind of changes dramatically in the context of the novel. Like it's a very different poem in the context of the novel than in the book of poems where it appeared. And for me, like one of the things I'm most interested in about fiction is like how you can take works of art and put them in novels and then kind of can build up a fictional world around an actual artwork. So I kind of wanted to see what would happen if I crossed once again the kind of as me, like as an author, and the Adam Gordon character as a kind of version of myself or whatever, and importing a real poem and making it function within the context of the novel was another way of kind of rendering problematic the border between fact and fiction. And also that poem is kind of about the disappearance of the author in a certain sense. So it kind of appears and disappears at the same time. Yeah, it's not just that the novel is a work of art, but the novel is a work of art that can assimilate all these other genres, right? Can absorb all these other genres. And so it's not exactly like a museum. I think of it as more live than that, right? It's more like a kind of space where you can dramatize interactions with artworks. And so part of that is that the book can become a laboratory for thought and feeling, right? And that's of interest to me. But I mean, it's also that in Adam Gordon, in a way, everything kind of becomes like a poem in the book, right? Like he kind of treats himself like a poem and other people like poems in the sense that he's always claiming that poetry is at its most interesting when it isn't merely real, right? When it has this kind of abstract potentiality and not just this concrete existence. And maybe that's a good idea for poems. Like when he's talking about John Ashbery's poetry, he loves the way that it kind of never finishes. Like it never kind of stabilizes into an artifact. It's always this kind of floating, but he gets into a lot of trouble when he starts like treating other people that way, right? Where he's always trying to kind of control his images. So it's both that the novel is a way of like staging encounters with artworks and also that Adam's ideas about art kind of spread out into every aspect of his experience, and sometimes that works and sometimes it has kind of disastrous effects. That's a really interesting question. In a self-portrait in a convex mirror, like a version of myself that's distorted in a kind of meditation, like that poem is kind of a meditation on artistic method, like how accurately one can represent herself, or the kind of impossibility of doing that, and how history kind of enters even the most intimate portrait of a personality. So I think there are lots of ways that poem would be relevant, but although Adam Gordon is a version of myself, and although the kind of rhythm of his consciousness is really important, I think what I was trying to do was not really self-portraiture ultimately. Like, I was less interested in kind of revealing something about myself than trying to get at a structure of anxiety about the arts and contemporary experience that I think is shared. Not that's universal, right, by any means, but I think that's shared. And also to think about the kind of contemporary experience of an American abroad, right? Like, but I do think that there's this whole tradition of like the kind of Hemingway figure abroad, where like you kill big animals and go to bullfights and blow up bridges. And Adam Gordon is a kind of commentary on the distance between that version of the American hero and Adam Gordon's kind of like heavily mediated experience of a Spain in which there's like a McDonald's every 100 yards. And even where the political violence, where the bombings are in part the result of the American War on Terror, or inseparable from the American War on Terror. So even when he tries to leave America, he kind of can't escape. So it's a portrait of the artist, and in this kind of the young artist in this context, and certainly like I share a lot of attributes, but the goal was not self-portraiture. The goal was more to kind of represent something about the texture of experience that isn't just personal. That's a good point. And I mean, the what he values about Ashbery's work is how it's a kind of mirror, how it like reflects your consciousness back to you in a way, so that you experience your own reading. You kind of like read your own reading as you move across his poems. So I think that's apt. And also like just the mirroring in the negative sense of how he's in this kind of narcissistic, kind of endless hall of mirrors, where he's often seeing other people only in terms of how he imagines they're seeing him, and it's this kind of endless regression of projections and simulations. And kind of one of the questions of the book is whether or not he finds any way out of that. Well, you're absolutely right that like one of the things, like I'm interested in a novel in which like it's not about the protagonist undergoing some dramatic transformation. I mean, there are of course great novels like that. There are also a lot of horrible novels like that, right? Which is kind of like I don't think every novel has to be about like the triumph of the human spirit. Like something horrible happens to someone and they end up being better for it, which is like what a lot of American fiction anyway is like. I'm more interested in a novel that leaves the question of growth or transformation or whatever open, so that that's a space for the reader to think, both because I think that's a more interesting kind of like literary approach, and because I think that's kind of truer to the ambiguity of experience in the world, right? And so you're right. It's kind of evocative of all these different genres of the coming of age novel, or the kind of portrait of the artist as a young man, but it doesn't really ever adopt any of the easier consolations of those generic forms. Although I also think that it's very contemporary, but I also feel like a lot of the kind of best novels in the canon do that too. Like I feel like it's not always clear what exactly has happened to the kind of to Stendhal's heroes or anti-heroes or whatever. I mean, the events are clear, but the kind of psychological disposition isn't always clear. So I mean, it is like kind of a contemporary mashup and subversion of some of those genre expectations, but it's also in a way very traditional, because one of the oldest like ideas about the novel, right, and the novel in many ways used to be a much more radical form, right, is this question about whether or not you can be identical to your experience, right? Like, are you having real experiences, or are they just simulations? I think both. I mean, it's a kind of there are reasons why we're so obsessed with the possibility of authenticity, right? Like keeping it real. or like the kind of slippery distinction between reality and simulacra. But at the same time, I do think those are, if not eternal questions, like they're definitely ancient questions, right? About how you can tell the difference between reality and some kind of shadow. So I think that part of why the novel is a vital contemporary form, if people are ambitious about it, is precisely because the novel has this privileged vantage on consciousness, right? The novel can kind of represent the disconnect between an individual consciousness and the objective world, and the kind of way that reality, insofar as it exists, is always under kind of construction and reconstruction. So I both think it's a kind of contemporary general cultural obsession, and I think Adam Gordon is kind of like a special privileged case of that obsession, where he's been kind of given this education that seems most useful for him in terms of being able to kind of like deconstruct or reveal the fallaciousness of art, or the fraudulence of art. But the question is kind of like, what about the other thing, right? Like how does what he know or what he believes in, how is it going to actually help him make contact with something like authenticity? And it's also, I mean, his kind of strategy is very traditional in the sense that like it's Socratic, right? Like he achieves truth by being so ruthlessly honest about his dishonesty, right? Like that's his mode of sincerity in the novel. So, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you know, the ancient Greeks didn't have like SSRIs and antidepressants and well, they did have tranquilizers, but of a different form, right? Like all these contemporary technologies of mediation make it very, very much in the present, and the political structure of kind of the saturation with all the mass media makes it in the present. But I also think it's a present version of concerns that are abiding and kind of across the centuries. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, just like how I was saying that I like the novel because it can assimilate all these different art forms, I also think the novel can assimilate all these different media.
Yeah.
There's all this kind of talk about new technologies displacing the book or whatever, and of course some of that is true, but there's also a way in which, like, the novel allows you to kind of produce a robust picture of what a life with all these different technologies looks like, right? And how a kind of culture that's so much more dominated by the image, like how you can kind of get some distance from the image in the book, a kind of critical distance from a culture saturated with the image. I mean, I also think a lot of writers, I don't think this is new, but I think there's a lot of this right now, are trying to do this kind of contradictory thing where you're trying to represent not just feeling, an intense feeling, but the absence of feeling, right? Like, what is the role of boredom or flatness, which is sometimes very difficult to distinguish from intense feeling in a contradictory way, right? Because it can have its own extremity or ecstasy or something. I don't have the exact language for it. And that's something that, you know, writers, both writers I admire and some writers I really don't admire, I feel like are kind of interested in. Adam Gordon is supposed to be writing this long poem about the Spanish Civil War, and he very much doesn't do that, right? Like, but in a funny way, a lot of the questions that are kind of raised by that history of literary's relation to the political come back into his life, even though he's trying to kind of avoid it. Like, when the bombings happen, it kind of raises more intensely the question of the relationship between historical violence and poetry as a reflection of the political, or as a technology for intervening in the political. Like, he has this kind of interesting take on it, I think, which I don't know if it's exactly my take, but I think I think it has something to it, right? Which is, he doesn't believe at all in the kind of traditional avant-garde claims for what art can do. Like, the idea that, like, poetry can be a revolutionary weapon, he thinks is total bullshit, right? And he talks about how he can't imagine a poem, you know, ending the war in Iraq. He can't imagine poems stopping Franco from, you know, whatever. But when he imagines a world without poems, when you subtract the arts, even though he's very critical of the arts and thinks kind of all examples of poems are failures in a certain sense, when you take that domain of virtual possibility out of the world, he says that he would kill himself, right? He says he would swallow a bottle of white pills. And it's like, it's a subtractive account of how the arts matter, but it's kind of, I think, a powerful account even of their political relevance. Like they can't intervene directly in politics. They're not. That's the domain where we get to imagine something other than what merely is, right? And so that kind of protects our ability to think alternatives to like the murderous status quo, even if it can't itself do anything about it. So, I mean, there's a weird way in which like Adam Gordon is both like the most negative kind of person you can imagine, but also has his own idealism about the importance of the arts. So that is one of the ways that I feel like, even though he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, he is kind of meditating on the political possibilities and limitations of art and politics. I did know that. I did know that book and that passage. And I kind of can't remember what I had consciously in mind or not, but certainly like, but I always associate like that passage in Stendhal as changing the way that like war was written about in novels and kind of helping to break with the kind of romanticization of violence and well, not just violence, but of kind of like national heroics or whatever. And so I think that definitely changed the way that it gave new permission for literary representations of the world, which let in some of the messiness of the violence. But if you try to imagine how we would perceive the world if the only ways of kind of exercising our imaginative faculties or whatever, the only ways of comprehending the world were like Fox News, I think that would be a very different world, right? I mean, that would be a kind of totalitarian disaster that in certain ways we're heading for. So again, like I'm unable to like defend the efficacy of any specific artwork at the same time as I feel like if you were to subtract artworks, then I could tell you the world would really be in trouble, so that I have this sense of its importance without being able to say like, well, I think Stendhal really intervened in the direction of history in that way or another. I mean, I do also think that question, what's his name, Fabrice, that the question that he's having, right, is like, am I really participating in history? Like, is this a battle? Like, how do I know if I'm part of this battle? That in a certain way, not just about like political violence or war, but for all domains of experience is really fundamental to the novel, right? Absolutely right. It's interesting because I think sometimes when you're writing, you repress your sources, because I might not have felt comfortable trying to like rewrite Stendhal, or there's stuff that I think is reminiscent of other novelists, but you only kind of like discover after the fact how heavily you were influenced, which happens to me in my poetry too. Like sometimes I'll think I've written something that doesn't have any like formal relationship to anything I've read, and then I'll discover that there was this poem I had read and forgotten, right? But forgetting just meant that it went into my unconscious and kind of did its work. No, I think you're right, and you put it really well. It's very intimately related to that. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, the first thing I think of is I remember reading about Sartre's like ritual, like about how much speed he would do, how much kind of how he would use amphetamines in order to write. And I think Adam Gordon also is trying to kind of set up a little like these kind of drug-induced conditions for being an artist or whatever. I mean, I don't know what it would mean for a novel not at all to be interested in existentialism and its legacies. And I think The Stranger probably had a real effect on me when I read it when I was very young, like really very young, like one of the first novels I read. That part of what's interesting about a first-person narration is what the first-person narrator can't say or doesn't know. So that's certainly there. And I mean, the book is very concerned with how you either create your own identity in kind of problematic ways, right? I mean, you'd certainly say that Adam has no essence or claims to have no essence and is trying to kind of figure out if there's like an identity as an artist that he can inhabit without despair, without bad faith. So I think the like vocabulary of existentialism, which was an important vocabulary for me at a time, is definitely there in the way I think about character and the kind of projection of character, right? I mean, everyone in the U.S., I don't know if everybody does this here, talks about like their project, right? Which really, I think, comes out of artists thinking that way, comes out of existentialism to a certain degree. And Adam is kind of always joking about his project, right? Like, and one of the questions of the book is kind of like whether or not there's a serious project being undertaken. You know, like, is he really like working out his identity and thinking deeply about questions about the arts, or is his project just this fraudulent, you know, hash-filled wasting of the government's money? I mean, it's probably both. You know? I think irony. I mean, I think of irony as like the way of moving between the tragic and the comic, right? Like, irony is what keeps it from being merely one or the other. I don't mean like irony just in like the vernacular sense, but in the idea that, like, for example, Adam claims that there are all these reasons to despair, but the book itself maybe is an argument for that he does find some possibility in writing. You know, the irony of the statement that he's never going to write a novel. But I think that the comedy, the humor of it, and kind of the humor in writing generally for me is one way of experiencing a space of possibility beyond what's merely real. Because like laughing at the absurdity of our contemporary circumstance indicates that you can imagine some alternative, right? That it's a construct, and it's often ridiculous. I guess I think of irony as the thing that keeps shuttling between tragedy and comedy, but it gives you a way of thinking about how reasons for despair can kind of be turned into their opposites, right? Yeah, it's a good question. It's a useful question for me. Because like the new book I'm writing, the new novel that I'm finishing, is kind of a move from a lot of the ironies in Leaving the Atocha Station to a different kind of bid for sincerity. I mean, it still involves plenty of irony, but it's trying to kind of move out of the kind of solipsism of one narrator into a kind of openness to a greater diversity of stories and possibilities. I was actually really resistant to writing the first novel, like for reasons I can't fully understand. I really thought of myself as a poet. I was like really resistant to certain kinds of fiction and conversations about fiction that I saw as dominant in the U.S. and not just like dominant in the mainstream, but even amongst more like experimental writers or whatever. I was kind of like surprised to find myself being pulled in that direction. And then after I wrote this novel, I thought like, okay, like I'm a poet and I wrote a novel. You know, that happens. Poets do that. But then the kind of book that was available for me to write, like the thing that happened when I sat down and write, became another novel. And I think it kind of goes back to that thing about the absorptiveness of the novel as a structure, where like a lot of the interests I have in poetry or visual arts, I can write into the novel. It becomes a kind of macro structure for all these other areas of interest, and then part of the compositional challenge and what's exciting is figuring out how to put them into a whole. I think it's the elasticity of the novel and how it can assimilate other forms as both like its greatest promise and to a certain degree its threat, because you can kind of fall apart, it can fall apart into formlessness. But, the new novel I'm writing has like a long poem in it, so even writing the novel, I'm still writing a poem, and it has like passages it talks about artworks that kind of I've written both in the novel and stuff that I was thinking about writing art criticism, which I do some. So I don't know, maybe this next one is my last one, and maybe there'll be a third one. I think that like as or more important than the events that a novel describes is the event of its language itself, like the sense of the sentence as an event and as an event of form and of consciousness. So for me, yeah, I mean, before I knew what I was doing with the novel, I had a kind of rhythm of syntax, like a kind of rhythm of this guy's thinking in my head, and that rhythm is in a way like what wrote the novel as much as any plan I had, right? Which was kind of letting the prosody of that thinking expand across the pages. And then the book is, as you say, very much a meditation on language and linguistic displacement. I mean, sometimes Adam Gordon's like being lost in a foreign language is this like moment of rich possibility, right? It's like a rich poetic ambiguity where he hears all these multiple possibilities in the language, and at other times it's just terrifying, right? And I mean, I feel that way in English a lot of the time. Like, I think it's a condition of any language, even if you speak it fluently. There's always an excess of meaning and possibility in an exchange, and that's really exhilarating, and it's also really confusing. So, you know, I mean, I believe in that kind of, at this point, it's kind of like a cliche, but that Wittgensteinian idea that to imagine a form of language is to imagine a form of life. I mean, language is the one inexhaustibly interesting and mysterious thing for me. I mean, it's just so primary in my experience that I'm almost bad at explaining why it's so important, because it seems, it's like the given, you know, it's consciousness, it's the possibility of the social to me, yeah. I mean, I think the novel is political, but political in a weird way. I mean, in the sense that I think that depicting political alienation in a novel as accurately as possible has a political function, like kind of naming the degree to which people feel disconnected from historical reality or possibility. So the novel isn't at all like programmatic, right? Like it's not like a blueprint for action, or the novel doesn't make any claims for what it can accomplish. But I do think that it tries to vitalize or kind of make felt certain contradictions in the moment. And I kind of actually think that like the really intensely felt representation of contradictions in fiction has a political function, right? I think it is important, and I think when the novel is really reactionary and embarrassing, or worse than embarrassing, or when people write novels that are all about smoothing over contradictions and creating easily digestible, likable characters with whom they can identify. So I don't think it's necessarily a radical act to produce a novel that tries to track all those different forms of alienation and little glimmers of possibilities of connection, but I do think of it as a political novel all the same. Yeah, and that the kind of the more that like a historical disaster is repeated, the less real it becomes. You know, that there's a kind of super saturation that's desensitizing. I think that part of what Adam Gordon is thinking about in the book is like all these different forms of media, from like the internet and cell phones or whatever, but also pills and poems, right? That they're all different forms of media. They're all ways of trying to experience a reality that's always kind of escaping, right? There's no unmediated reality. Like all these different media are different ways of calibrating like proximity and distance. And sometimes they make you really distant even from the thing you're very close to. Like, so he reads about the Atocha bombings, like before he realizes they've happened, he's reading about it on the New York Times webpage, which is like nowhere, right? It's not even in New York. It's just kind of in cyberspace. I don't feel like, you know, media, like new media or technologies, are good or bad. Like I feel like, or even if they are good or bad, that just seems like beside the point, because they're powerful. And so the question is like, what are the what are the negative consequences, and what are the modes of possibility? And I think it's unpredictable too. You know, I don't feel like we know what it's going to look like in 5 years. And even though I'm more scared than I am optimistic, like for every way the technology becomes an advance for a kind of totalitarian, spectacular culture, there are also like possibilities that open up for resistance and alternatives. I mean, I'm sure that many people in many countries feel this way about Americans, and not just Americans, but kind of Americans in particular. This idea that Americans and American artists are kind of like they see other countries as material, right? Less as kind of life itself, and more as material for like the production of their own genius. And in Spain, there's this historical tension which has to do with all these like American students or whatever, and not just students, but all these Americans who go to Spain to study fascism, to study Franco, and somehow Americans have convinced themselves that the United States was really opposed to Franco, but in fact, as a kind of counter to Soviet influence, we were like very supportive of Franco. So a lot of Spanish people I know are very tired of like the next American student who's coming to write about how things went horribly wrong in Spain, while kind of American style capitalism or imperialism is doing what it's doing. This kind of like obliviousness to history that manifests as this feeling of historical superiority amongst novelists, historians, or whatever. So yeah, Carlos, who's also his kind of rival, who he feels very jealous about, is, I think, making a joke about the American like experiencing history merely as material for his art, and thinking that he understands it and can shape it into a book. And I think it's a smart dig for him to say. Like, it's the kind of thing Adam Gordon most wants to avoid being accused of. I don't know how it really works in France in this language, but in the US, experimental means kind of like avant-garde. He's kind of making a joke, a kind of sad joke in a way, about how he's experimenting with drugs and all these identities and all these social situations, and he kind of is always experimenting and never actually maturely inhabiting any particular present. And so he's kind of an experimental writer, but instead of it being this like valorized avant-garde sense, it's in this more kind of fraudulent sense where he just treats everything as a kind of game or something. But the thing about Adam is that about that narrator, is that he's so unreliable that even his self-criticism is unreliable, right? Like, he always claims not to speak Spanish and not to be a real poet, but there are these apparently very intelligent people around him who keep saying, like, you do speak Spanish, like, when are you going to quit pretending to be a fraud, right? And of course Teresa's like, I'm translating your poems, they're of interest to me, like, why do you keep pretending that you're not serious? So in a way, I think as you read the book, I think you might come to doubt his own self-deprecation, that might seem like another strategy that's protecting him from having to feel like he's actually trying, so he kind of claims, he puts himself down as a way of trying to prevent having to take himself seriously, but other people tend to take him seriously. I mean, definitely a lot of the writers that have mattered most to me, both in fiction and poetry and other kinds of writing, are associated with the avant-garde in one way or another. But I'm also really kind of tired of the self-declared avant-garde's repetition of vanguard gestures, as if to do what was done in 1912 or whatever in 2014 is the same thing. And there are a lot of things that are considered avant-garde or experimental that I think are just kind of lazy. But, I think to really be an ambitious writer, you have to kind of refuse both the mainstream conventions and the kind of official avant-garde culture, right? They're both traps, and you have to kind of, you kind of have to write, you have to kind of, you have to kind of move against or away from both at the same time somehow. So, I mean, I think any serious writer is an experimental writer. I mean, they have to experiment and find a form that's appropriate to the work, and they have to discover something in the act of composition. But I do think that what it means for fiction maybe is, like in the kind of normal conversation in the US, is that you're not just interested in plot. Mm-hmm. And that I definitely consider myself to be an experiment. You're basically, so I think I would be fine being called an experimental writer. But I guess the last thing I'd say about that is I just think that that's like a title you have to earn, and not just like an ideological position you adopt, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you see all these writers who kind of like just decide, yes, like most of my influences in the US are poets, really. And a lot of the prose that's influenced me that I've read in the US is not American prose. It's writers like Sebald or Bolaño, and also I've always felt this permission with prose to just read in the past as much as I read in the present. I mean, there is great stuff in the present. I don't mean to sound totally negative, but there's just also a lot of garbage. And the novel was such an outrageous, ambitious, like Tristram Shandy or something is like a crazy, brilliant book, and then you read a lot of like what passes for ambitious fiction now, and it's just like, it's like television. It's like, and I like television when television's good, but I don't need to get my television from books. Like I can watch HBO, you know. I mean, Sebald is maybe a recent, everybody loves Sebald, so you feel like when you mention Sebald, it's kind of a cliche, but he really made me think about what ambitious writing could look like now, even though we're of course very different writers. But I was also, you know, influenced by Bernhard's writing, and I mean, I've been very influenced by Virginia Woolf in this new book, even though it doesn't sound at all like Virginia Woolf. So I don't know, more and more I feel like I don't even like we were talking about Stendhal, like was I aware of that passage? It's kind of like I sometimes think I'm the last person who really knows my influences, you know. No, I mean I would be honored. I mean, a lot of the fiction that matters most to me is European or Latin American. And I think there's a lot of ambitious South American and Latin American prose right now, which is great. I mean, they're great Americans too, but I think that when we talk about American writing, in part, like what America often means is just a kind of blockbuster commodity, and that's of course true everywhere. I mean, it's not just like an American phenomenon, but insofar as we mean that, like literature that's kind of made, even literary fiction that's kind of made for a certain kind of consumption, right? Where the book seems like crowdsourced in advance. It's like, it's kind of like the book's like written to please an audience that exists, as opposed to a book that wants to produce a new experience for a reader that may or may not exist yet. Like that kind of stuff I hope to avoid. I hope to never write a book like that.